Hi, my name is Fran Mayer, and welcome to another Napa Institute conversation. Archbishop Borys Gudziak, born in Syracuse, New York, is the son of Ukrainian immigrants, a graduate of Syracuse University, Harvard University, and graduate studies in Rome. He now leads the Ukrainian Catholic Archeparchy of Philadelphia and serves as Metropolitan-Archbishop for Ukrainian Catholics across the United States. He's a member of the Synod of Bishops of the Ukrainian Catholic Church and Rome's Congregation for the Oriental Churches. He also serves as president of the Catholic University of Ukraine in Lviv, Ukraine. And Archbishop, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for being attentive to Ukraine's plight.
Before we get into our discussion, we also have with us Mr. Timothy Bush, who's the founder of the Napa Institute. Tim, you have other duties today, but I wonder if you'd share your own thoughts on supporting the church in Ukraine before you need to leave us.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you for hosting this very, very important interview at an extremely important time in our history, not only for the Ukrainian people, but the entire world. And Archbishop Gudziak, who's been a regular attendee to the Napa Institute, many of you have met him, participated in liturgies with him, is at the fulcrum of the Catholic University of Ukraine, where he serves as the president. And I have gone to Ukraine with him and witnessed in Lviv the importance of this country. And I'm very, very proud of your countrymen, Archbishop. They have been amazing resistance to one of the biggest military forces in the world. And I think this is going to be the Battle of Lepanto. And I'm really, really excited to hear the interview. So I'll be standing by. Thank you, Fran.
You bet. Thanks, Tim. And let's get on to it, Archbishop. Archbishop, you visited Ukraine just before the current Russian invasion. What was the mood, and did people really believe it was going to happen?
I was there until the 15th of February, the first 2 weeks of the month. First of all, let us begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And ask the Lord's blessing on everybody we mention. I invite you to pray for those who are defending freedom and dignity in their kids in schools and hospitals, but I also ask you to pray for the conversion of Vladimir Putin. And pray for those poor Russian kids who are, there's 5,000 Russian soldiers killed already in this senseless war. So when I was there, the horseshoe around Ukraine, the 200,000 soldiers were there. And the even before I went, the Americans were pulling out most of the diplomatic staff. When I was there, it was kind of a crescendo. All the other embassies started pulling out everybody. Then they said, all Americans out of the country now. We're not going to take care of you if you don't leave now. So that was happening while I was there. The people, there was a mixture of kind of stoicism, apprehension, and resolve. People, they're not soft. In Washington, if an inch of snow falls, there's a run on toilet paper. There was no run on the grocery stores. There was no run on the banks. 15 million people were killed in Ukraine in the 20th century, mostly by the totalitarian regimes, whether Soviet or Nazi. And the country's been in a state of war for 8 years. It's been under siege for 8 years. So this kind of is a new story for the world that kind of forgot the silent war in Ukraine. But so as February, opened, people were apprehensive, stoic, but also their resolve was building. And I don't have to explain the resolve. You can see it now, that iconic situation on that island where, the megaphone with I imagine everybody saw it, where the Russian Navy comes up to this pretty bare island with just a few buildings and says, surrender. And they told them to, go fly a kite. I'll show you later some stats. According to numerous parameters, the Russian army is 5 to 10 times as big and as strong numerically, but it is not motivated. It doesn't have, those kids have no reason. This is a senseless war. There's no reason to be doing this. While the Ukrainian army is fighting for the life and death of their country, their families, etc. So all this was building up, when I was there. Right before I left, this must have been like, the 14th or 15th, I talked to a banker. A banker walked in with a journalist for the Toronto Globe and Mail, and we just started talking. The journalist just came in because there's going to be a war. The diplomats were leaving, some journalists were coming in. And the banker said, well, a week ago, I thought it was a 30% chance, but now, I think it's 50%. People didn't expect it, but they're not surprised. Because of history, because of the fact that, the Russians have occupied Ukraine at different times over a 350-year period. Basically, he had told President Bush still that Ukraine is not a real country. So that's what the atmosphere was like.
What is with your friends and fellow clergy persons in Ukraine? What are you hearing from them? How is it going now on the ground there?
So I spoke to the head of the church, His Beatitude Sviatoslav Shevchuk, who is in Kyiv. He and the bishops and priests have taken a position that we're going to stay there. We're going to stay with the people. You see that in the public expressions of the president as well. He's had to move around because, like the president, so too, Greek Catholic bishops can be expected to be on the hit list. In the last 250 years, every time the Russians, either Tsarist, communist, or Putinist, take over some part of Ukraine where the Ukrainian Catholic Church ministers, the Ukrainian Catholic Church is visibly liquidated. It can be in a matter of months or a year or two, or it can take a decade or two. But we're gone. We're gone. We're obliterated. And of course, there's been the whole Paschal story of death and resurrection. We weren't supposed to exist as a church, and basically, there were at Stalin's time, we weren't supposed to be much of a people, culture, or language either. So the clergy is there. Kyiv is divided by a river, and the left bank of this river that's about a mile wide, it's giant, the Dnipro River, is flat, and the right bank, the western bank, is hilly. And the right bank is now considered pretty exposed and dangerous. So he's in a safe house somewhere in the city. I just talked to two bishops from Kharkiv, two Ukrainian Catholic bishops from Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city, which is the one you see the shelling, being shelled today, houses, residential quarters. And one of those bishops lived also in a residential area on the exposed side, and today he moved to be living with the other bishop. There was a curfew over the weekend, round the clock. For what reason? Putin had sent in months ago, beginning in the fall, but heavily in December, he sent in secret agents through the porous border and hoodlums who rented apartments in different cities. And they were kind of sleepers. They were supposed to emerge when the assault began. And so they've been emerging. They're not in uniform. Some of them are just, not actually regular soldiers, but they're supposed to create chaos. And what has been happening is over the weekend, they've been, both the armed services of Ukraine but also the territorial defense units that have sprung up are cleaning these guys out. So the cities in the east have been very dangerous, whether it's from rocket fire or these hoodlums who are supposed to create chaos. Because if you go back a month ago, what Putin, his plan was to destroy the government and the structure of the state. If necessary, he was going to invade. But I think he had also a hope and an illusion that he thinks Ukraine is so weak. I'll show you maps later. He thinks it's divided. And he thought that with pressure and with some chaos creating activity, there would be protests, there would be run on banks, there would be run on food, and the government would collapse. Well, that didn't happen. And now these guys are being rounded up. So everybody was in bunkers and in subway kind of, undergrounds. Priests would go there. There would be prayer there. There's children being born there. There's life in this situation. In the meantime, 500,000 people have left the country or left their homes. Maybe they're still, kind of near the border. And today's estimate that I read on a French website by international humanitarian observers is that there could be up to 7 million refugees. But the clergy is staying in place.
That has to have a huge impact on the morale of Catholics in Ukraine. I mean, the president has acted very wisely as well, just deciding not to run, but to stay.
Yes, yeah. I must say I'm surprised. I was not a great fan of his. Mm-hmm. He was, kind of a comedian. Yeah. On TV shows, making money. He was in his late 30s doing this, making fun of everything, even, some dramatic moments of Ukrainian history, the genocide and stuff like that. He's not a deep person by his background. Mm-hmm. But I think there was a certain degree of sincerity. And, Paul was persecuting Christians until Jesus knocked him off the horse. We convert, we can grow. And I hope I will convert someday,
Archbishop, I want you to talk a little bit about this Russian obsession with seeing Ukraine as part of Russia. I mean, why, given the ethnic and lingual and religious history of Ukraine, what actually distinguishes Ukraine from Russia?
Russia. Well, it's like if you asked what distinguishes Spaniards from Italians. Mm-hmm. They're different. They're different people. They got a different language. They've got, different history. They've got a different psychology. Ukrainians don't line up straight. They're kind of a little bit anarchic and freedom loving. Russians have had autocratic rule basically for their whole history. And they kind of suffer well, they get beaten up and then they put monuments to the rulers that killed many Russians by their policies. How can you have a Stalin revival in Russia where Stalin probably killed 20 million Russians? You probably killed 50 million people in general. So Ukraine is. Let me show you some maps here, which might just show some stuff.
Hey, Archbishop, I'm not sure that Americans really have a grasp of how the Second World War impacted Ukraine. You mentioned Kharkiv a couple of minutes ago, and there were 4 separate, really ferocious street battles in that city between the Soviets and the Germans during the Eastern Front in the Second World War.
Yeah. I think something like 15% of the population of Ukraine was killed during World War II. I think the French population was like 0.5% or 1%. Belarus suffered even more. I think Belarus was over 20% of the population was killed. So the whole country, you know, I mean, was devastated.
There we go.
Okay.
There we are.
So yeah, we've got some maps here. I'm going to jump around a little bit because I'm prompted by your questions. Okay. Can you see that is Russia, the red? You can see that's how big Ukraine is. That's you know, the battle here, David and Goliath. Now, Ukraine is the biggest country inside of Germany. It's bigger than European France, and it's bigger, I mean, the country in Europe, it's bigger than Germany. But Russia is 11 time zones. How much more do you want? You know, we're beginning Lent. Today we begin Lent in the Byzantine calendar, and you'll be beginning on Wednesday. And we'll be thinking of our sinfulness. And, you know, what is the sin of human nature? It's the sin of Adam. What did Adam do? He grabbed something for himself. It's the ego pulling to yourself. While our Lord, God, loves and gives. The Father gives to the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Instead of this gesture. This is the Russian gesture. You know, we want more. So Ukraine is, you know, really putting up a fight. Now, historically, the written history of Ukraine, the written history begins in the 10th century when Christianity was adopted in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. Moscow didn't exist for another 200 years. But you know, just as 1,000 years ago, people living in France were not Frenchmen. There were nobles and kings, and then there were peasants who lived there. There were the locals. Kind of national identity is a modern thing, really from 19th, 20th century. So you had these principalities. The central one for this empire was in Ukraine and extended northward, covering around about this territory here. It was called Kievan Rus, R-U-S with an apostrophe, palatalized. And that entity is what Ukrainians say is their, you know, their medieval history. Now, Russians say, no, it's our medieval history. Why? Because, you know, for 500 years, we wrote the history later. But there was no Moscow. The Russian area where people speak in Russian, etc. This was this northern part that was embraced or conquered by the Kievan Principality. It's very complicated, you know, 1,000 years of history is very complicated. What eventually happened is that this northern part became strong and it conquered Ukraine, to put it simply, in the middle of the 17th century, beginning around 1650. And it held most of Ukraine. It held most of Ukraine up to here. The blue, the lighter blue, the crimson, and the red. From 1650 until World War I. Then the communists took over and the border was pretty much the same. This part was under Poland and under the Austrian Empire when Poland was divided. And this is where the Catholics, the Eastern Catholics, were concentrated because they were wiped out here. Now, in this part of Ukraine, the Ukrainian language was made illegal in the 1860s. There was a decree that said there is no Ukrainian language, there was no Ukrainian language, and there never will be a Ukrainian language. It was only until in 1905 that in the Tsarist Russian Empire, which covered about that same area, of that we have here, it was only in 1905 that the Tsarists allowed Ukrainians to print in Ukrainian, print books, publish. So this struggle about colonizing, crushing, suppressing has been going on for centuries. In the 20th century has been a century of the struggle of Ukrainians to have an independent state. They proclaimed independence at the end of World War I. That lasted for about a year and it failed. And then Ukraine was partitioned between the wars, between Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and the Soviet Union. And it was only when the Soviet Union fell, at the end of World War II, the Russian Soviets took over even the part that had been under Poland. And this is what Putin said a week ago on Monday. He said, it's Lenin that created Ukraine, because he put it all in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. His fantasy world, kind of version of history. But people were there. There was a culture. There was a language. There, were shared ideals, and all of this came together when, in 1991, as the Soviet Union was crumbling, Ukrainians voted 91% of the population everywhere together. 91% voted for independence. Now, this map shows you. This is a language map, right? The dark red shows where, it's basically most people spoke Russian. The lighter red is predominantly Russian. And as you go west, it's Ukrainian speaking. And this is because this part, the red part, was really developed in the 19th and 20th century when Tsarist Russia and Soviet Russia were really in control. And they actually developed these parts. I mean, it was under Russian government control that most of the settlements here, and this is the coal mining region, and the metal iron region. This is like, Pennsylvania was in late 19th and early 20th century. And this is the Donbass. These are the two regions that had the Russian-led separatists, not Russian-backed separatists. You should understand they're Russian-led. All of this was run from the Kremlin. Now, there's also the voting record. Is this the one? So this is this shows you the vote in 2010. And you can see it's similar to the language, and it's similar to the historical divide. This western part this part was never part of a Russian empire really until World War II. And this is where the Eastern Catholics were. And so everybody in 214, when there was a revolution of dignity, everybody, CNN, BBC, everybody was kind of drawing a line like this along the Dnipro River. Sometimes it might be here, saying, these are just two different countries. They speak a different language. They've got a different history. And Putin's intention, Putin's intention was to basically, here we have, he wanted to separate this off, at least this part, including the capital. So he took a big chunk by annexing Crimea, and the Ukrainian army in fort was down to 6,000 battle-ready troops. That's why they couldn't put up a fight to those little green men that showed up. You know, Putin said, we're not there. It's these little green men. And it's, you know, the people themselves that want us, and etc. And then later said, you know what? We had been planning this for a long time. Those were our troops. We just didn't have, you know, the present KGB is called the FSB, the Federal Service of Security. They organized this separatist movement here. And you had a war for 8 years with 14,000 people killed. And from these regions, from Crimea and this eastern region, there were 2 million refugees over these past 8 years. 1.5 million who were hospitably received here, belying this idea that these are two inimical parts of, you know, artificially put together country. And what we're seeing in these days is these are the regions of the attack. And we're seeing that the whole country is fighting Putin. The whole country is fighting Putin, and it is holding up, even though this, you know, this is, we saw the territorial David and Goliath. Look at the military.
Oh my.
This is the aircraft, the attacking helicopters. You know, it's basically 10 times. Mobile rocket launchers, tanks, armored vehicles, personnel, and the budget, the military budget is 10 times as big in Russia. But you've got Russian soldiers that, you know, there's 800 Russian soldiers that have been captured or who have surrendered. There's a lot of interviews with them. I looked at 36 minutes of interviews with them. And a lot of them saying, you know, they didn't tell us until 2 days ago that we're going into Ukraine. A month ago, I was working as a policeman, you know, halfway across Russia. And I was, you know, brought in here, supposedly into Belarus for training exercises. And they took away their telephones, and they live in, you know, in a bubble. I mean, you know, I don't know how many Americans look at Canadian news, much less French, German, or Russian news. I mean, French, German, Russian news. Russians don't look at other news. They're zombied by the propaganda. And so these kids are there, and, you know, there's already over 5,000 Russian soldiers killed. We don't know the Ukrainian casualties because they're not announcing them. I'm sure they're significant. But clearly they haven't been able to advance. And, you know, it's a disaster. It's, you know, the people, the buildings are being, residential buildings are being bombed. Here you see people in a cellar. You can see all the pipes in the cellar, in the bomb shelter. You know, he's attacked another bomb shelter, a priest leading prayer, you know, the bomb shelter. And, you know, it's a pietà. It's, you can see this mother probably in a bomb shelter, or maybe it's a refugee, you know, holding a child like Mary held Jesus. And the world is praying. You know, at the Wailing Wall, you can see somebody with the Ukrainian flag in Jerusalem praying. But children are being born down there in those bunkers.
Archbishop, can you talk a little bit about the Maidan Revolution and also the Holodomor? I think Americans are really unacquainted with both of those terms and experiences, and it might provide some useful historical content.
So between 1914 and 1950, about 15 million people were killed on the territory of Ukraine. Between 1932 and 1945, it was the most dangerous place on earth. If you're going to get killed, it's most likely, you would be killed if you lived in Ukraine. And what happened was you had 2 world wars. You had the Soviets come in, the Nazis come in, and the Soviets came back in. And when Ukrainians declared independence in 1918, that independence was suppressed with great difficulty. And Stalin knew that the population of the country did not, it wanted independence. It wanted to be free, and it didn't want to be Soviet. It didn't want to be atheist. And so he decided to break the back of the peasantry. In the fall of 1932, he requisitioned in central and eastern Ukraine, the part that was under the Soviets, all the harvest, everything, to the last cupful of grain. Soldiers would go around and just take everything. Of course, people might have been able to hide something, but it wasn't enough to survive the winter, in the spring, in the summer, until the next harvest. And on the most fertile land in the world, after a plentiful harvest of in summer 32, 33, 4 million people died in Ukraine, agonizingly, of hunger. It's a terrible way to die. It's excruciating. And the idea was to break the back of the peasantry that did not want to give up its land. They were, little tiny capitalists. I mean, they wanted their land. And Stalin was introducing, terror socialism. So that's one genocidal wave. Now, the Jews of Ukraine were wiped out by the Nazis. Probably at least 1 million Jews of the Holocaust, maybe 1.7, were killed.
But, one of the things that the audience may not know is that Ukrainian guerrilla warfare after the Second World War ended continued until the mid-50s. The Ukrainians were fighting both the Germans and the Soviets for their independence, and that wasn't suppressed by the Soviets until the mid-50s. So the fighting went on for a very long time.
Right. So that was the Holodomor. And your other question was the Revolution of Dignity?
Yeah, the Maidan Revolution.
The Maidan. So over the last 30 years, see, what happens when you're traumatized by genocide, and when that genocide repeats, and over 3 generations, there's you live on bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder called Ukraine. You develop mechanisms of fear because the outside world is dangerous. So you have to protect yourself. You wear a mask, you put up a facade, you build up a wall. And moving out of the land of slavery to the promised land, biblically, it takes 2 generations. It takes 40 years. You live as a slave. And so what Ukraine has been involved in, it's been in this pilgrimage from fear to dignity. And there was kind of a revolutionary movement that led to Ukraine's independence. And it was Ukraine's proclamation of independence that brought the Soviet Union down. That was the kind of thing that made it all fall apart in 1991. Then a post-Soviet former big communist boss became president in 94, and he created something that Putin later perfected in an evil way, was this oligarchic system where there were a few oligarchs that paid homage to the president, and the president basically said, you can steal as long as you pay, as long as you obey me. And in 2003, 2004, when there was a falsified election, when the outgoing president, after 2 terms, tried to install a more pro-Russian president by the election. And you remember the candidate Viktor Yushchenko was poisoned, and there was this kind of uprising. People came to the Maidan. Maidan in Turkic and Arabic means square. So these Arab revolutions were also on the Maidan. And, you know, 1 million people would show up protesting in 2004. In 2013, the same guy who had falsified the election in 2004, he lost. He actually became president in 2010. He reneged on a promise that was the policy for the country for the previous 15 years to move towards European integration. And the young people said, no, 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 we don't want to be integrated with Russia. We don't want to go back to that authoritarian, genocidal past. We want to be connected with the world. And they started this protest, which lasted for 3 months, which in the end was met by sniper fire in the main square of the country in broad daylight, and 100 people were killed, including one of our faculty from the Ukrainian Catholic University, a 28-year-old historian poet. And the country just, you know, exploded. And the president, the pro-Russian president, just fled the country. And that's when Putin decided to punish Ukrainian democracy, civil society, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. This virus of liberty was threatening to, you know, infect Russia. And so he said, we're going to bleed this country. We're going to kind of, at the eastern side, incite this, this simmering war. We're going to cut off Crimea, and we're going to watch it collapse. And the economy was devastated. In 2014, the Ukrainian currency lost 2/3 of its value. The dollar was 1 to 8, 1 to 25. So people lost, you know, the purchase power of their money. But the country rebuilt from 6,000. I told you there were 6,000 battle-ready troops. It slowly progressed, and now it has, you know, 150,000. And in the last week, there's been 100 new volunteers. Most of those volunteers are veterans of this war. There's 400,000 veterans of this war. So this revolution of dignity, and actually the Ukrainian Catholic University might be the place where that emphasis, the word dignity was because I went around speaking. I had a talk that was called "How much does your dignity cost?" You know, is worth selling your dignity. Before this whole episode in 2013, and that's when this great tension developed, because Putin saw he's losing Ukraine. It's not going to be like Russia. It's not going to be subservient. Georgia, you know, needed to be punished in 2008. In 2020, when Lukashenko falsified the presidential election, observers in the exit polls showed that his opponent, the woman, Tikhanovskaya, got 60% of the vote. But results showed that he had 85% of the vote. And that's when Belarusians, you remember, started protesting, and he beat and arrested over 10,000 people. There are about 1,500 are still in prison. I just met the Tikhanovskaya and I spoke on Thursday night in La Place de République in Paris at the rally on last Thursday when this, new stage of the war began. So Putin wants autocrats in former Soviet countries. That's why in January, the Russians helped the autocrat, in Kazakhstan. Many hundreds of people were killed there. And that's why he gets along with China and Venezuela and Assad in Syria. And this is a big danger globally. Will this be a way of government? The president of Brazil cozies up to him. And India, along with China, was one of the countries in the Security Council this past week that abstained from condemning the invasion. And I'm sad to say a president of the United States who was critical of just about everybody, dismissed just about every politician disdainfully. The one politician in the world he never criticized and who he admired and who last week he called a genius was President Putin. So we've got this problem of people that don't understand what democracy is, or better yet, they understand it and they fear it, because in democracy, you have to share things. Estimates now are saying that Vladimir Putin is worth at least 100 billion. He's among the richest people in the world. And these strong men everywhere. Now it's being revealed, the Kazakhstan president, what kind of palaces he has in Bavaria, much less in his home country. And people don't want this anymore. Ukrainians don't want this. And they're not going to stand for it, and they're giving up their lives for it. They're fighting.
Archbishop, the Eastern Catholic Church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church is the largest of the Eastern Catholic churches. Could you talk for just a moment about the way that the Eastern Catholics, the Ukrainian Catholics within Ukraine, were treated by the Soviet Union over the past few decades?
Right. So if you remember, I pointed to you that the Eastern Catholics were in the Western part, and they weren't part of the Soviet Union until 1939, when the Soviets came in the first time. Then the Nazis came in, and then the Soviets came back in the summer of 44. And within months, Stalin decided to liquidate the church. And in April of 45, he arrested all the bishops and also many priests. Some were, killed in this process. Some were actually killed in the first 1939 occupation, shot, executed, etc. And he basically said, you have to join the Russian Orthodox Church, which was totally state-controlled. See, the Russian Orthodox, in that giant Russian empire, there were 100 dioceses with 100 bishops in 1918, 17. By 1939, the Russian Orthodox Church had 4 active bishops. It was reduced by 95%. It suffered incredible martyrdom. They're great saints who gave their life for the faith in the Russian Orthodox Church in the 20s and 30s. But when Stalin started losing the war against Hitler, in 1942, he decided he needs the support of, the Russian tradition, which means also orthodoxy. And he called in the patriarch in the middle of the night, and he said, listen, we want you to start developing your structures and support the war to save the motherland. And the patriarch said, well, we've got a little problem with personnel. And he said, why do you have a problem? He couldn't tell Stalin because you killed them all. And so the Russian Orthodox Church began a new life in 1942, but that was totally controlled. And in 1945-46, the Ukrainian Catholics said, you're going to join this church or you're going to Siberia. And every single bishop, not a single bishop folded. And hundreds of priests, many of them were married with their families and children, were deported to Siberia. Many, many died as martyrs, and 10% of the Greek Catholic population, 400,000 people out of 4 million, were deported to Siberia.
Oh.
And the idea was that this church would be eliminated. By 1985, it was down out of 3,000 priests, it was down to 300 priests in the underground. Because of Stalin's death, the priests deported to Siberia were allowed to come back, but they couldn't serve publicly. They served in houses, in cemeteries, in forests. And there were, by the mid 80s, only 300 left, with an average age in the late 60s in a country where the life expectancy of males was 64. So the Soviets were saying, well, we don't need to kill every last, and they're dying anyway. Well, now there's 3,000 priests again, and the average age is about 42. And there's 800 seminarians for 4.5 million faithful in Ukraine. There's probably about 1 million outside of Ukraine, 1 million faithful. In 1900, our church had 3 dioceses in Ukraine. Then came a century of persecution. And this is how God works, brothers and sisters. How many dioceses do you think the Ukrainian Catholic Church has? It has 16 dioceses in Ukraine and 20 outside of Ukraine, 36. In 1900, it had 3 bishops of 3 dioceses. Now it has 52 bishops of 36 dioceses.
Wow.
And this was not a strategy. This was grace. This was martyrdom. This was, as the head of the church, who I had the pleasure of the privilege of studying under Cardinal Slipi, who spent 18 years in the Gulag and was released after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Pope John the 23rd intervened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Khrushchev wanted to thank him. And the Pope said, well, why don't you release Slipi from the Gulag? And Khrushchev said, he's still alive? I put him there. Because Khrushchev was head of the Communist Party in Ukraine during World War II when the church was being liquidated. And he said, all right, let him go. He's 71, frostbitten legs, crippled. He'll live out his life quietly in some Roman monastery. Well, he came to Syracuse, New York in '68. I should show you a picture, but I don't have it here. And as a 7-year-old, I was dressed up in costume. I spoke Ukrainian well, and they said, you're going to give him flowers and you're going to kiss his hand. I didn't want to kiss his hand because, American kids don't do that kind of thing. And that kind of was the beginning of the change of my life. He's the one that I went to study with in Rome. He created a prototype of the Ukrainian Catholic University. All the Roman cardinals laughed at him. I mean, into their fists. This guy's, a little bit loony after the Soviet trauma. What kind of university? There's 300 Ukrainians in Italy. And when I came, there were 11 students in this university in all years.
Archbishop, what is it's the only Catholic university in the former Soviet Union, isn't it?
Yeah, between Poland and Japan. Today, it's a small school. It's a David in the world of Goliath. It's got 2,000 students, but it has the highest incoming SAT scores of any of the 200 universities in the country, and not by half a point. It's by 3%, which means the best students in the country want to go to this school.
What are your goals for it? I mean, you're president of that university, and you certainly have some sort of long-term strategy about how it can affect the direction of the country.
Well, the life of the church and spiritual life and life of our families, your family's marriage, it's not all like simple or perfect. This story of the church's resurrection is not like a black and white story. The trauma and the atheism of the 20th century means that today in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, 15% of the population goes to church regularly. And in Eastern Ukraine, in some places, it's 1%. Mm-hmm. So there's more people going to church in Paris Paris is 4%. Then in some, Eastern Ukrainian cities, Moscow is at about 1%. So our students come from a country that is unchurched. Some students maybe have never been inside of a church before coming to the Ukrainian Catholic University, and they don't all automatically become people who say the rosary daily. But like Jesus, Jesus came, all those listeners to Jesus happened to be unchurched. In fact, they had problems because they were, hooked to all of these rules, to the law. It was sometimes worse than being unchurched. And so that's what we're doing. We're witnessing by quality, by love, by fellowship to a young generation. And, we've got now graduates who are members of parliament. We've graduated 500 priests since 1999. And they're all over the world where Ukrainian Catholics exist. And we hope to find a language for the 21st century to witness in a convincing, maybe even compelling way.
Archbishop, how can I want to be sensitive to your time, and also there'll be questions from the people who are in this conversation. What can we do to help? I mean, what can an average American Catholic do to assist the church in Ukraine?
We've been very clear about this. It's like a mantra for the last month. Three things. There'll be a quiz at the end for everybody. These three things. Pray. Today, EWTN radio did an interview with me, and they said, okay, we know we can pray, but tell us what how we can help. I said, wait a minute. Don't pass over this first point so quickly. This is what changed history. The Soviet Union fell apart, not through armies, not through strategies. George Bush was in Ukraine, George Bush Sr. was in Ukraine 3 weeks before Ukraine proclaimed independence. And he said, stay away from your suicidal nationalism. You have to stay together in the Soviet Union. It's easier for us to deal with one power. We don't want to deal with 50. Nobody expected it. And it fell apart. Why? Because it was the Lord's will to take these people out of this slavery. So prayer is essential. And people from Ukraine are saying, we can feel the prayer. I mean, we have no chance against this army, statistically speaking. But it's 5 days. And we're standing. The capital is standing. Second, information. Unfortunately, a lot of people have been duped. Holy man, I talked to him a week ago. And he says to me, well, I had this opinion that Putin is a defender of traditional values. Russia has the highest abortion rate in the world. Astronomical alcoholism, divorce, suicide. It's full of social problems. And corruption is the way of life. And people can think, conservative Catholics can believe that Putin is a protector of, traditional Christian values. So information, you have to get into this story. You have to understand. People can use gender language, or we're against transgenderism, and be against the human race at the same time. And naive. It's not easy. It's a complex story, and you have to spend some time to understand it and look at it critically, and then share that news, because politicians make decisions based on polls, on what people think. And when people say, that's far away, it's complicated, Putin's policies of propaganda have worked. Putin wants Americans to say, it's so complicated over there, we're not going to get involved. It's too complicated. We've got enough of our own problems. Information is very important. And third is help. There's going to be there is already a massive humanitarian crisis. These are response. Of course, now I think many countries, governments are going to help. Maybe a group of Catholics like yourselves, maybe you can concentrate in helping the Catholic Church in its ministry in this difficult time. For example, a fund for military chaplains. These soldiers, these people that defend the country, they need a priest there. And these priests need support. And we need to get more people, more priests out to the front. That's an idea.
Archbishop, you have, through your Archeparchy, the ability to contribute to the church needs in Ukraine, don't you? And I think the Knights of Columbus also have something to that effect.
Sure. And, Catholic Relief Services is getting ready to do something, and the Bishops' Conference, and, there's beautiful mobilization. We're very grateful to the prayers Ukrainians are getting, from you, you wanted to hear about this story right away, and you've come and showed up and you're listening. We're very grateful for that.
Yeah, I think, Fran, one thing we'll do as an institute is, as this video is shared more widely, it's being recorded. So as it's shared more widely with those who couldn't join us live, we'll include a link to the Knights of Columbus Fund for Ukraine. If Bishop Borys has a link for the Archeparchy, we'll put something there as well. But then we'll also share a link with all of you for Ukrainian Catholic Universities, so that you can get involved there, both now and after this conflict's over, because it's really quite a remarkable place. Kristen and I have had the privilege of being there a couple of times. I think one of the most symbolic things, Bishop, is how you built the church right over the top of the headquarters of the Western Ukrainian or Western Soviet Communist Party's headquarters. You built a church right on top of it. The church always conquers, and I think many of the listeners here and many of the people who follow Napa Institute would really like to be involved in supporting the work at Ukrainian Catholic University, even after this is over. So we'll include that link as well.
Answer one of the questions that's in the chat. Has there been a message from the Orthodox patriarchs? This is a very sad story. And this is a story of what happens when we kind of, sell out. I don't know if you've been reading George Weigel's stuff, but George is, very eloquent on this issue. Last Monday, Putin had a hate-filled kind of speech saying why Ukrainians are nothing. They have no history, they have no present, they have no future. That was Monday. On Tuesday, he moved massive numbers of his troops into the part that the so-called separatists had occupied. That's Tuesday. On Thursday was, in the night from Wednesday to Thursday was the invasion. On Wednesday was Soviet Armed Forces Day, Soviet Armed Forces Day in Russia. And Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, issued an enthusiastic felicitation thanking Putin for his leadership and for everything for Russian Orthodox. Now, the new man in terms of world visibility is, he's quite brilliant. He's a musician, he writes. Scandalously, he's got a doctorate universities in the West. On February 2nd, Ilarion received one of the highest state. Saw with the presidents coming in to visit Putin in the last, weeks. Macron or the German chancellor, they sat at this table that must have been 50 feet long. Putin would not sit next to them. When Ilarion got his award on February 2nd, he was right next to him. The Russian Orthodox Church for the 8 years never spoke out clearly against this war. And it never challenged Putin. And it's not doing it today. You know, it says we want peace between the brotherly, you know, Ukrainian Russian nations. Well, if you want peace, you're the altar boy for the guy that's waging the war. Tell him to stop the war. You're right there in Moscow. But, you know, they're on the payroll. The Russian Federation sponsored for 70 million euros, which is what, 80 something million dollars, a new church and a cultural complex for the Russian Orthodox Church on the Seine, right in the middle of Paris. And you saw maybe St. Catherine's Russian Orthodox Church right by the Vatican, where the Pope went. It's right next to the the Russian embassy. So it's a sad tale. And in the long run, it's going to be a source of great shame, like it was for Christians who, you know, did not stand up to Hitler in Germany. Okay, there's a couple questions. Jim?
Archbishop, could you comment on the suggestion that some seem to be making that the international community recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk regions as independent and at the same time promote neutrality for Ukraine?
Well, what that means is give Putin what he wants. Do you reward, you know, war criminals? Do you reward people who act like this? For Ukrainians, this is unacceptable, and they won't accept it. You know, who knows what will happen? In Chechnya, Putin bombed the Chechen cities, killing 10,000s of Russians who lived there. We'll see, you know, what the conditions will be, but it's not Ukraine's neutrality that Putin wants. It wants the fall of Ukrainian democracy, because it's that this is the one take home I really want you to take home. Maybe two or three, actually. One is Putin is waging this war because Ukraine is a democracy, and he is afraid that this virus will pass on to Russia. The second take home is every time the Russians take over any part of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Catholic Church there is wiped out.
Thank you. I would have two other questions, but I'd yield to others who are asking.
Donna?
Hi, Archbishop. I'm sure everyone recalls that after the third secret of Fatima was revealed, John Paul consecrated Russia to the Blessed Virgin. Do you think we need to have Pope Francis do that again?
Well, it's like prayer, you know, it's never bad to repeat things. And, you know, we need to pray. It's not just the act of consecration, you know, because the Pope is consecrated Ash Wednesday as a prayer for peace in Ukraine. Right. It's a consecration to God. But the question is, will people pray?
Well, I've been praying since Thursday.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And many have been. And, you know, there's voices from Ukraine saying, I can't believe these bullets missed me. The shrapnel didn't hit me. Keep those prayers coming. I mean, you saw the proportions, the geography, the budgets, the army. This is David against Goliath, and David is still standing. We'll see, you know, we'll see what happens. But yes, prayer, you know, prayer is very important. And the Ukrainian church leaders have consecrated, you know, Ukraine to the Mother of God a number of times. The first time was 1,000 years ago in Kiev and Rus. That was the first time Ukraine was consecrated to the Mother of God, and it's been repeated a number of times. There's a great veneration of the Mother of God in the Ukrainian tradition.
I was thinking more in terms of Russia, in the fact that they're just so godless.
Yeah. Well, you know, Putin, he goes to church on Easter, lights a candle, and is, you know, gives awards to the Russian Orthodox leadership, and they, you know, servilely pay obeisance to him. You know, many of us are godless. I mean, you know, we look at our country, we need to be careful, you know, when we kind of talk about, I wonder what I'm going to be faced with at that last judgment, you know. In our prayers for Lent, we do prostrations. We drop to the ground on our knees, and one of the prayers says, Lord, let me see my sins and not blame the other one. We need to pray, and I am convinced that there's going to be, this is my great hope in my prayer, that there's going to be a great transformation. That this crisis, this Via Crucis, this Golgotha, is going to lead to a resurrection. I don't know if Putin's going to be left standing. I pray for him. I went to these where the is from, say, last Wednesday, the day before the invasion. She lived for 24 years. She was a mystic. She was like nobody, you know, just a nun. At that point in France, I think France had 100,000 nuns. I mean, she was just one nameless, unrecognized nun. But she lived so purely and so profoundly, so mystically, made her a doctor of the church. And I prayed for that simplicity to come into the hearts of all the people involved in this. May the Mother of God, may the Lord himself, may the Holy Spirit bring to the hearts of men and women, but particularly men, because women aren't the ones that start wars. Bring a spirit of the gospel, a spirit of charity, a spirit of peace. Szczęść Boże.
Szczęść Boże, Panie Arcybiskupie.
Dziękujemy za solidarność Polaków.
O, wszyscy popieramy, wszyscy dajemy. But let me switch to English because I think we're losing most of the audience.
Sure.
I spent 2 years in exile, thanks to Stalin in Siberia. I've gotten to know average Russians. They're religious, they're good people. The fact that I'm alive, I owe to one Russian old lady who brought me medicine in the form of watermelon. I couldn't hold anything down. I returned everything. She brought me a piece of watermelon. I kept it down and I survived. So I'm sort of have a perspective on these things. As you know, Archbishop, in a Russian tradition, the Russian Orthodox Church have always been very closely united, or actually under the control, authority of Russian Tsars. Now, that habit never changed. This is why when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church decided to separate itself from the Moscow Patriarchate, not only the Russian Orthodox leaders objected to it, but also Putin did. This was a betrayal, not only religious separation, but also state betrayal. I mean, state political betrayal. So much for my comments. My question is, would you post on your website or on the Napa Institute website addresses, perhaps, of families that we can adopt from here and support them directly, for example, those who are in Poland? This gives the whole operation, if I can describe it this way, a personal touch. And I think many people will be attracted to this. They'll be supporting concrete people, women with children, elderly, and those to whom they can see their contributions going and actually benefiting from. If you can do that, I would appreciate it very much. Thank you. And God bless you.
We could do that.
Błogosławieństwa.
John Chernetsky, your last question.
Yes. Hello, Excellency. John Zarnetsky from Ave Maria School of Law. It's nice to see you.
Yeah.
For everyone, I posted a title of a book that I believe Archeparchy Gudziak was the author of or edited. That is just an excellent book about the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, extremely moving. Excellency, I wanted to ask, and you touched on it, but I wanted you to expand, if possible, about what contacts you're having, what is the information you're getting from the Greek Catholic clergy in Ukraine. I know you were just there, but you know, they say that the Catholic Church is the best intelligence organization in the world, and I just wonder how much information is getting out, and if there's anything we can do also to magnify that information.
So the way it's at least as long as the internet is still up in Ukraine, it's quite easy to talk to people. You know, I had some text exchanges and then a conversation. I spoke to 2 bishops in Kharkiv, which is the city that was particularly besieged today. I spoke to 3 or 4 people at the Ukrainian Catholic University, including the rector of the university. A priest that I just ordained 2 weeks ago, who is he actually came to the Napa Institute 4 or 5 years ago. You met him, Volodymyr. He was a deacon. John was over for dinner just before I left for Ukraine in January. And he grew up in Belarus. His parents lived in Belarus. Now, Belarus is, you know, a real, you know, it's a dictatorship. His parents could not come to Philadelphia for his ordination. He's the only son. And he hadn't been home for 7 years in Belarus. So we decided that we would do the ordination in Ukraine, where he had gone to school, the university, et cetera, seminary, and his parents would come in. And they succeeded in getting an exit permit, which is not easy to get in Belarus now after these, you know, disturbances. And, you know, 3 weeks, 2.5 weeks ago, he was ordained. And in the last 4 days, he's made 2 attempts to cross into Poland because he's my right-hand guy. He's my secretary. And today he was refused for the second time. Ukraine is not letting out any men between the age of 18 and 60. And we'll see, you know, I'm going to talk with the Ukrainian ambassador because she knows him. He's not fleeing the draft. He will help me help Ukraine here. I forgot what your question was, why I got on this tangent about this the contacts. So I'm talking to him. And as long as he's stuck there, I told him, all right, we're creating the Ukrainian Catholic Crisis Media Center.
Mhm.
The website's going to go up probably tomorrow.
Oh, that's terrific.
And he's going to be our representative there at the Ukrainian Catholic University, which itself is a hub. It's got a journalism school. Some students are going to contribute. So there's all, we have all the news. There's never been a war that has been so wired. You know, this morning, in a few hours, I know what the Russian POWs are saying. I know where the rockets are falling in the country. I know what the casualties are. I know, where different bishops are. This was unthinkable, even 15 years ago. Just the quickness on some of these social media, we're just getting notifications of significant events going on throughout the country. So, but the Catholic Connection also opens up, the story, what are people living? What are they feeling? What it's like in these bunkers? I was talking to that in the church, and all of a sudden the siren went off, and he said, sorry, I have to go down into the basement, and, I'm going to lose connectivity. And then you kind of start feeling, yeah, this is for real.
Archbishop, thank you for your time. You've given us an enormous amount of time today, and we're very, very grateful. Would you mind closing with a prayer?
Yeah. Lord, we know you're the master of history. We know that you've counted every hair on our heads. We ask you to keep our hearts at peace. No matter what the injury and the injustice, that we not hate. We ask you to convert the hearts of those who kill and conquer. And we ask you to give great strength, courage, and joy and peace to the people of Ukraine, to the defenders, to the brave people in government, to the mothers, the infants, the aged, the handicapped, to all the refugees. Protect them, save them, guide them, and may your will be done. That of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
God bless you, Archbishop.